we'll continue straight with Pelin Tan, who is here already, and I'm also extremely excited uh, to host today. I also had the chance to met Pelin some time ago, and immediately became fascinated by Pelin's capacity to basically engage with people and kind of really build the bridge between the kind of abstract construction of places and the idea of space into a space as something that is practiced, as a space as something that is social relations. And I think that is one of the references that I used for the kind of idea and construction of this project is the emphasis in what is common to us, and I'm paraphrasing telling here. What is common to us is not necessarily or not limited to what we share, but also what we produce as social relations. And I couldn't be more excited to kind of continue this conversation based or initially prompted by the question of the institution and how much we ourselves are subjected to or participate in institutional thinking and ideally and hopefully Pelin will give us another thought on the idea of commoning and sort of constructing this practice. Pelin is a sociologist and art historian, researcher, interventional methodology, artist. She works in kind of all spheres of life. I couldn't be more excited about thinking about this notion of Pelin engaging with food, with landscape, with ecologies, with river, with communities, sort of spread all over the world. She teaches in multiple places, always engaging with difficult questions in spaces of conflict or contested territories. So I will just leave that as a kind of a short, brief intro. Of course, for all participants, there is a formal bio on the web with links to their institutions, quote unquote, that they participate and engage with. But I'll just let Helen continue and the day and the second half. Thank you.
Marcelo, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm speaking now from Turkey, and it is 6 p.m. here. I try to open now, Marcelo, the whole enter full. It's
Upload it.
okay, I think, huh?
Let's see. Yep.
Marcelo, yeah,
Yep.
okay. Um, this term, I think, common and commonings is really very much discussed in the last years, especially in the architecture faculties, in the studios, design studios, and also in many my colleagues, my designer and architects colleagues who are working as an NGO also, not only inside the academia, architecture faculties, but outside too. And it has a lot of, I mean, it's a kind of a simple term. And Marcelo was telling also sometimes in some in theoretical discussion, we are talking a lot that giving reference to David Harvey or to other theorists, that commoning is more building up a social network, social relation, and it has a kind of a different um, background of discourse than 70s of commons, and some in an ecological perspective it has something commons and some discussion and practice, and I would say the discussion has some universal part, what really commoning and commons is, but at the same time it has a lot of differences when it comes to scale and different kind of geographies. I'm trying to understand if commoning is a universal ethics, either in urban, either in any kind of scale of spatial condition, what would be the formula? This is a bad question. I mean, it's a good question, it's a bad question, because I think having a formula of commons is really stupid. But at the same time, if you're involved in especially especially during COVID last 1 year, about survival, how we can survive collectively, in caring, some ethics of, not only about human, but also about, environment and ecology, which is not a human centric, um, an ecological determinist view. How we can do that all together. This is, it has a lot of, it looks very complicated, but then, the discussion goes in different part in the same way. This is why I was thinking what could be at the end. In my slide I have some kind of suggestion, but I'm very much always referring, and I'm very much inspired by architect, urbanist, Stavros Stavridis, from Athens National Technical University architecture faculty. He is there based as a professor, and he wrote a lot about, urban commons, especially in Greece and also in Latin America. I mean, um, how commons is not about, creating a common platform of being neutral of something, which has to do with the public space debates too, but it's more about, negotiating continuously between the different group, between different community, and accepting. I mean, by, by defining urban commons as a negotiation, is also accepting multi communities in our society, which has to do also struggle against racism and many other, sociological and political issue, and struggle, social movement, new movement is also, an important discussion, especially with the Occupy movements. We are talking about a very heterogeneous, type of urban and rural and collective struggle. And this has to do very much about how to discuss inside the struggle about commons, organizing the struggle, organizing the movement, and also commons outside, creating the commons in our everyday life with the others. And this has a lot to do with the rights. I mean, mostly is been, affiliated with the rights to the city discourse of Henry Lefebvre, urban commons. But I think I would say, like, referring Hannah Arendt, rights of the rights. There is so many rights nowadays we are, trying to defend. So the right to the city sometimes can remain as a little bit, upper middle class claim, by leaving many communities rights out, can be really sometimes conservative. So it's also a kind of a discussion. So when you speak about commons, everything has to be redefined continuously. But, I will agree with Staros that he always says that it is part of a struggle, negotiating or rights, if we want to build a commoning practices. I always refer to feminist economic geographers, Judy Graham and, Elizabeth Gibson, and they are, researching, in field, and writing about it, and writing about heterogeneous, uh, economies, arguing that, capitalism is not so much is not an homogeneous, entity, is not an homogeneous word, but there are several different kind of related, production and labor, is being produced, and there's a localities, matters. There are ethics matters. The ethics of locality, they wrote a lot, and they did a lot of, if you check their books, like post-capitalist, about post-capitalism, and, other, their books about community economy. They're really trying to find, analyzes and mapping about how, small economies and interrelated reproductions, especially, how they are related also so strongly to build commoning practices. I try to always go back to them, read them, and try to understand their theory and so on. Um, there is I put a lot of examples about, um, uh, collective gardening, community gardening, which is always a kind of a common issue, and it became very important in the last COVID condition, and how woman has a role in. I was following in the last 10 years some different kind of little infrastructures like that, and how such infrastructures are not only pointing out about foraging or cultivation, uh, which is not only, I'm trying to say, it's not about only um, trying to get produce our needs as vegetable and so on, but is also about a practice that brings people together and opens a different kind of discussion about our collective needs and collective survival, that has not only focusing, I think, about human or citizen, but also about other non-humans too, and the whole symbiotic cycle. um, I'm here referring to Silvia Federici's one of her last book, I think. She wrote about commons, and bit a history of commons too, but from Africa and from America. This example that she's speaking about is in America, that how women are farming, cultivating along the roadside rail lines. I understand. I get very much empathy with this paragraph because my grandmother was foraging in around the highways and so on too, in Turkey, in a little village in the west coast of Turkey. And maybe the reasons, economical reasons behind that is very different, but or the history of capitalism can be different. But still, you feel very quickly that how this responsibility and symbolism works in different generation and geographies. Um, I was focusing a lot on how uh, uh, indigenous practice is really a heritage, and how this heritage can help us to maybe inform our commoning practices. And we are speaking a lot about that nowadays, about food sovereignty, rural, redefining rural contra, not contra urban, but rural inside urban, and how we can see those infrastructures with the whole development nowadays. You see in the picture a Kurdish woman like foraging in one of the Greenland hinterland of Diyarbakir, which is under dispute of opening to big housing projects. And this dispute is ongoing. And she's one of the dispossessed villagers who is an urban citizen now in Diyarbakir, and mostly spending foraging and cultivating in those lands. Um, I was working also in Pearl River Delta in China, and I was following those. Um, I mean, always I was. It was not really following, but it was coming and pumping up front of me how female labor is a kind of a methodology to understand practice of commons. Here you see a Chinese fisherwoman who's making her net, fishing net, with her body, and how those little garden on floating on their dwelling on their sea on the river. Um, it's kind of representing a little infrastructures for me. I was trying to put really the Gibson Graham's map, diverse economies map. I use this map a lot to put reproductive labors and different kind of structures, and try to understand how the space is functioning, how interdependency is functioning. I think it's so important, especially I like very much with architectural methodologies, is so quickly to use such research methodologies in the studio or in the research to understand how space and labor and related gender is functioning, and how we can learn from that. How we can learn was one of the way how we can understand commons. And I was teaching a few years ago the advanced architecture studio, a master studio, and it's very strange, but because I'm not an architect, I don't have a diploma in architecture, I cannot teach undergrad studio. except with an architect. But in the master, I can have a studio. This is another architectural pedagogy question, but I continue. This was a Yazidi camp, a Kurdish Yazidi camp, around 3,000 people who escaped from ISIS from Shengal to Turkey, and Mardin, where I'm living, is just 20 minutes by car to the Syrian border, and we are receiving a lot of refugees. And in 2013, 2014, we're receiving a lot from Syria, and many people were hosted in temporary spaces, and some refugees were hosted in refugee camps, official refugee camps. And I was with my student, we were very much interested with the self-organized camp, temporary camp. The one reason was that because they were building around us, so we were in us living somehow in this reality. And we started to engage with Yazidi women who were mostly building their own camp with existing material. And we started to map their everyday life in the camp. Um, I want to say that when I say camp, it has so many different spatial way. There is an official camp run by government and UN, which is very highly protected. It's like an open air prison, something like that. And there are some temporary camps that the people either go into an existing building or into an open space and build their own tent given by UN, and with other recycled structures, and they are trying to find their own way of building their settlement. So this camp was one of them, and we call it camp as commons. Commons in Turkish, müşterekler in I think in Kurdish there is no direct word. It says mutual, kampeu mutuals, but I don't think it's a direct word. So it's a kind of important to think differently with other language also, common space. And in like Alessandro and Petti and Sandi Hilal, the architects decolonizing architecture, they use al-masha, common place. They don't want to use commons exactly, for example. So it's important also to think about commons is in a different cultures, and how this culture is related to becoming together, creating a space together. In this camp, for example, the Yazidi women were not allowed by their husband to sit openly on the public space. So they built corridors with blanket and wood in order to create their own semi-public spaces. I have some videos about that, but we don't have so much time here, so I cannot show. But this was kind of important, a small scale architectural element for me, how like 10 meters you can walk in those constructed camp, and this corridor is functioning as a semi-public space for those women that we were sitting and having tea, and also connecting each other's camp tents together. So this was something that we tried to check. We produced a little booklet. I can send this booklet. You see the pages from the booklet is English, Kurdish, and Turkish. And we realized that every tent immediately set up a little community garden, cultivating vegetable and many things, and immediately going to farming. Also, Mesopotamia Ecological Association from Diyarbakir brought some seed, and they collaborated, they workshopped with those children and women, and they created small camps. And we try to understand how the cycle of cultivating and producing and this whole relation is being built. This camp, I want to say, was for 1.5 years, I think. After it was dismantled, this camp doesn't exist anymore. Most people went back to Shengal, and some of them went to prefer to go to a official camp, and some of them maybe made it by boat across Mediterranean to Europe. This camp was destroyed by the Turkish government. We went with my student, especially. I took them to Lesbos, to Pikpa camp. Pikpa was also recently destroyed, I think, by the Greek government. It's a solidarity camp, self-organized camp. Is a for receiving and hosting shortly who just arrived from the boat, from the water to the island, the migrant and refugees. So there was a lot of cultivation and coming together and being into this kind of permanent practice. I mean, cultivation is a permanent practice, and if you're temporary, it's so difficult to cultivate. So I was very interested with this, metaphorically, with this idea that you are continuously in border crossing, but at the same time you are cultivating. This was an amazing thinking for me, that how is powerful um, of creating a commoning practice that is in continuously different changing geography, and then is fluid, and then it becomes not anymore about producing vegetable, but more getting connected in solidarity. And this was the infrastructure for me, but I understood from commoning practices, not creating garden and food garden or vegetable garden, but and not understanding and grasping this as a romantic ecological activity, but instead creating a kind of a healing, let's say healing and care infrastructure that functions for a while and then continues to function with the move of the migrants to another place. I was very um, interesting for me that I met people, and then I met people in Pikpa, and then I met the same refugees in Athens in another place. So it was something like they are moving, and I was moving with them and meeting them. One maybe Marcelo was referring was this case, City Plaza Hotel in Athens, an hotel which was an empty place, and it was occupied by in one night by families, refugee Syrian families, and with Greek activists. And this was an idea also for the activists, why camp has to be outside of the city, why it is always put not inside, but has to be built outside, and people has to be kept outside, kind of a heterotopic space, maybe as maybe Foucault will describe. But why an existing space in the heart of the city cannot be a camp too? Why we have a kind of a fixed idea of spatial idea that camp has to be like a emergency space built in one night, or with the help of UN in a kind of a normative planning manual that UN has one that. And how could we imagine a space of occupation that squats, let's say, and how the space can run? I think the space did run 3.5 years or something, and it was collectively was running with the refugees and activists together, and it was really difficult to sustain in the heart of the city, not only for survival reason, like finding vegetables from the Athens markets in the evening and coming and cooking and reorganizing the breakfast and so on, but also taking the children to the school, and also resisting against the racist attacked, right-wing fascist attacked in this neighborhood. So there were many things that has to be organized in the kind of a small living scale in a hotel, and how in such a small scale in a big city is functioning and is dealing. And this was, I think, what I experienced, what I saw was the most difficult commoning experience, I would say, for both sides, for the activist side, also for the refugee side. I think collectively they decided to close and leave the space last 2019. It was. This is another COVID situation. We're discussing more and more about green spaces, ecological spaces, and collective community gardens, and it's becoming more important. And there is a lot of, sometimes for me, how do we discuss that Are we discussing that through urban middle class? Are we discussing, I mean, how does class play a role? How does gender play a role in that? And how the spaces are functioning, not only cultivating things and vegetable, it's not about, I think for me, only how we can get organic natural food, how human gets, everything is so ecological, human centric and determinist that the nature ecology, this clean vegetable has to be for human, how we can get that. I see always that it's a little bit opportunistic kind of way of thinking, and how we can change that, how we can change this spaces as a learning spaces, as a pedagogies of indigenous communities and so on. This is also another kind of layer of commoning, how pedagogy, alternative pedagogies, how indigenous pedagogies make a big important case um, for that. I would suggest many people. I would suggest Elizabeth Hoover, who is an anthropologist working on food sovereignty in America, especially indigenous societies and communities. And I will suggest Sakia from Ramallah, who are based in a village near Ramallah and trying to really work on decolonial practice, again focusing on rural land knowledge of nature and sharing, and different kind of care practices. Mm, this is pictures from Beşiktaş district. This was created, this community garden. We call it in Turkish bostan, kind of an unorganized vegetable garden, community garden. And what is we see Merve Gül Özokcu, who works a lot about commoning and commons, and she's also member of Architecture for All, an NGO in Turkey, and she's working a lot on ecofeminism, commoning practices, and she was sending me those photos that how they created during COVID in the heart of the city of Istanbul. I went through creating also many projects. One of the project was in Italy, in Matera, in south of Italy. I worked with 28 villages, and artists and architect corresponding those villages. And the main aim of the project, when I was invited as a curator, the demand from Matera Foundation was I had to create community gardens for those villages in their abandoned public spaces, by inviting architects, designer, and artists. You see the map, which artist, which architect worked in which village. This was a bit a difficult project for me. I never did such a large scale curating. And I had to be, you can imagine, I had to be in every village at the same time. It was really strange. And there was a lot of problem that I faced. What are the problem in creating commoning? Even disputing for a small vegetable garden, how communities are getting conflicted, how infrastructure of electricity, water, internet is important in creating the spaces of commons, and how different communities are dealing with our migration, I mean, global migration problem right now. Most of the south of Italy, this part, Basilicata region, is hosting many refugees coming from sea by boat from Mediterranean, and they are working in the agricultural land of Basilicata as a seasonal worker. So it was very interesting also to engage not only the Italian citizens in the village, but refugees who are living in the village, and who just came from Nigeria, who just came from Afghanistan, and how they know to cultivate differently about different vegetables and fruits, and why was this knowledge becoming facing an existing village knowledge. It was interesting for us to experience and see that. um, the we can discuss that. Marcelo can ask me that. We had a lot of different kind of scale and layer of commoning, which I would say it's so heterogeneous that if you apply from a 32 garden, 28 village, even though they are in the same region, And I invited Luigi Coppolo, who is working a lot on this kind of practice, and Michael Lung from Hong Kong, who is an activist and designer working on the rooftop and many village struggles. Someone is asking, Nidia Gutierrez asking question. Please, Nidia,
Yeah, you
you
can
can
go
ask.
ahead and
Yes,
unmute.
yes, I wanted to ask Ms. Pelin about the experience in Athens because I had a chance to visit in during Documenta 14, an experience by Rick Lowy, who probably Marcelo knows. He's an
Yes, I know Rick.
oh, you
He's
know
my
Rick,
friend.
yeah.
I know Rick.
So
Yeah.
is it
Yes,
the
yes.
same space he was working with?
No, but I will tell you. Yes, Nidia, it's not the same place. But as you know, Rick was also invited to create a space that he did in Houston. You know, the low houses. I
Troyer Road.
visited.
Yeah, for your
Yes,
grow
I
house.
visited this in Houston too with him, with Rick. And he there is. I mean, the neighbor is near to Victoria Square. And this Victoria Square is generally for lower income people, refugees, and migrants are spending time in this. It's different than Syntagma Square, for example. It's a little bit like a periphery of the center. And in one of those neighbors, which is 3 streets down of City Plaza Hotel, there's a corner, a kind of a showcase shop, and Rick and Maria Papadimitriou, who is a very important social engaged artist, also from Athens, they both established Victoria this initiative, and this functioning totally different than City Plaza Hotel, but it's very important neighborhood solidarity and collective place too, and it's very nice that you reminded me that, because this has also a very valuable contribution as a place of commoning, I would say. Um, and this is a different place. City Plaza was 3 streets further up. And of course, Rick's and Maria's project that they initiated is more like funded with cultural institution and was visible through Documenta through cultural institution. But City Plaza was more anarchists who were occupying a place, and they were giving more a different kind of self-organized, autonomous, anarchic experience. This is a different kind of commoning practice, and I would say that there is a lot of anarchic root in commoning. I'm maybe older generation in our conference here knows better than me from the 60s and 70s such practices, but then there's also like culture-led social engaged art practices that could be also spaces of commons. I would not hierarchically define them, but I would say that self-organized structures, like who doesn't have any funding, who doesn't have any institutional representation, it's so interesting for me how they're running, how they're creating this ethic also. How they're going to the Athens markets in the evening, collecting the vegetables, coming back and cooking in the kitchen. I was cooking too in City Plaza when I was visiting City Plaza Hotel, and then how the food is shared and so on. I mean, this is like really from scratch, without any funding, institutional representation. I'm not saying that this is better or this is a better example of commoning, and that is not. I'm not saying that. Please don't understand me wrong. But I'm just saying that I'm very much interested how such autonomous, self-organized structures can stay permanently, or should a common space of common should stay permanently? I don't know.
Yeah, I think.
Do you want to say
Billy,
something, Marcelo?
yeah, I think that was a great comment in relation to one of the things you mentioned earlier about sovereignty, and about the relation of commoning, maybe even as a practice of helping constructed sovereignty. And I think it kind of relates to what you just mentioned, which is the practice of commoning, not necessarily, and maybe correct me if I'm kind of understanding it differently, but the practice of commoning not necessarily as a practice of institution or
Yeah, yeah.
institutionalizing, but mostly
Sure,
as a
yeah.
mostly as an infrastructure. And I wonder if you
Yes, yeah.
could maybe elaborate more a little bit on this question of sovereignty or the opportunity of the commons as an idea of sovereignty, but also kind of liberating of the body. And if in some of the previous things you have done, also you discussed the question of scale, right, which is critical
Yeah.
to
So I,
right, the scale of the body, the scale of the garden, the scale of the city, and so on.
yeah.
So maybe you can could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I will just come back a little bit
Yeah,
later on that
yeah.
scale in my last. I'm just approaching my last slides, Marcelo, and
Go
I will
ahead.
come
Yeah,
back on that.
absolutely.
I just want to say that this infrastructure and question of sovereignty or governmentality, we can all connect it with neoliberal governmentality, that how institutions are playing a role in redefining not only such practices in art and architecture, but we it's also about valuing, creating the value of that. But I think struggle is always part of commoning practices. um, and collective struggle, I think, has to do more with how we question sovereignty, how we question as a citizens in the city or in relation to institutions, I would say. One example, opposite example, when I was speaking about City Plaza and Victoria, how they are um, differ as an infrastructure. It is interesting. I had a lot of funding for Matera project for and I was half we failed. I mean, having a institutional representation and having all this sources doesn't really ensure the commoning practices. You need more than that, I would say. Of course, in Rick's example that Nadia was giving, it was, I think, is a very successful example. As a scale, is in a neighborhood, a small scale. Also, I mean, Rick and Maria are really experienced in practice of building up such infrastructures. We will come back on that, Marcelo. Let me just go over with this
Yes,
current. I'm
absolutely.
curating a current project called Cosmological Gardens, represented by Center for Arts Design and Social Research in Boston. And this is a kind of subtitle, Land Cultivation and Care. And we are actually, because of the COVID, we're doing a lot of seminars right now. We did one seminar series about discussion about, for example, food sovereignty and cooperative. How cooperative can um, work as a conveyor of infrastructure and institution. I mean, one example could be Luigi Coppola, artist Luigi Coppola, agriculture cooperative, Casa de Agricoltura in south of Italy, that he built with his village 10 years ago. I mean, this could be one example how the whole village is run by an agricultural cooperative, in not only including the citizens of the village, but also the refugees, and creating a lot of pedagogies on seed, on soil, and many things, and also producing and selling product. This could be an interesting, I thought, this cooperative, a kind of instituting structure, not say like institution, but more a instituting structure that that functions as a mediating such food communities. This is one thing that we discussed a lot. And of course, indigenous knowledge as an heritage about seed, about soil, about air, about water, about animal, about insect, and so on. How those whole knowledge creates a whole worlding, I mean, whole cosmos of indigenous communities that also functions not something a knowledge for us to use, but also a resistant knowledge, a decolonial knowledge that could be against colonial, settler colonial structure, violence, that could be against capitalist invading violence and so on. So we were going through different in Palestine, in Syria, in Colombia, in Italy. We were going through small communities as an example to understand their world. And this is also important, I think, is the core thing about if you want to define care and cultivation and land, by also preserving this knowledge. We will. I have a website I will send later about this project. I will shortly present what we're doing now, except this project curating, but with Luigi Coppolo and Vivienne Sansur from Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library from Palestine. We are working. We were invited by Mariana Pestana, curator, who is curating the Istanbul Design Biennial right now, called Empathy Revisited: Design for More Than One. And we went to try to create map the Mediterranean, the route, I mean, for me especially, the route of the refugees from Middle East, around Mediterranean, Anatolia, to Greece, to Italy shore, and how seeds are, we call it seed, I mean, seed not only as a thing for using to cultivate something, but as a kind of a living entity, that how this seed is mapping or geography or landscape and or infrastructure. This is why we call it an entangled kinship, that giving of course reference to Donna Haraway, but how we can see seed, how we can become friend with the seed, and how we can both we can try to think about infrastructures of caring seed and its solidarities, but also how we can connect those different fluid geographies that are divided by borders, but is at the same time traveling. I mean, how the seed is traveling through. This is we are trying to create a collective um, uh, mm, let's say libraries. I have a map. I'm going to send in chat this link. But this was linking many little Bostons. I want to say that also maybe you will be interested. Another city, Izmir, had a design week this year, and the design week topic was commoning. And many designers discussed in 1 week this topic. Here you see a kind of initiative, Kemeraltı Komşu Bostanlar, Kemeraltı Neighborhood Community Gardens, again by urban planners and artists and designers who are living in some streets with the inhabitants together. They are created those gardens. I mean, this was something like we can discuss. I think for me it's very important how we can discuss anti-capitalist commoning. I follow a lot George and Sylvia's work to try to really think that commoning is also about labor, about redefining reproduction, is about different scales and landscape, and how with this kind of literature, thinking and social realities, how it is connected with the landscape, the spatial context, like the one I was showing with the Ezidi camp, the one I was showing with the Chinese fisherwoman who's working all day long and engage with water of the Pearl River Delta Sea, and also with the effects outcome of Anthropocene too. My last slide would be that we can open for discussion. I was thinking, I mean, it's so interesting that this word concept that I wrote is so much related to uh, contra architecture, like scale of commons. I mean, scale is very important when we are in a design studio. We start first defining the scale and what kind of scale we are dealing with, how we can think not a rigid entity. I mean, scale is always socially, politically conceived concept, but how we can think scale as a in architecture as a fluid entity that starts from a toilet to occupied squatted hotel to a racist neighborhood to economical trashed country to Mediterranean migration. And so I can go long and long and come back. But this kind of fluidity of scale is so important for me to think together if I want to specifically build and redefine commons. Degrow is important, which is again is contra mainstream architecture. You know, I mean, architecture about, for example, housing. Think about the scale of housing and satellite cities are always about making growing more and more, expanding the city. You know, architecture is functioning sometimes only for that. But how we can think degrow in like making our life economical share in the dependency base daily life a smaller base community economy, and how we can use architecture, think about architecture as not a something that justifies growing, urban growing, whatever growing, but in reverse degrow. I mean, what will be the function of architecture in degrow? Interdependency and labor, it's so much important if we think about architecture offices. I mean, the highest one of the labor exploitation happens in architecture and design offices, and this is sometimes as we are focusing a lot about not white collars but worker, other colors, or worker class. We don't think so much that how designers and architects are more exploited than maybe a farmer or a worker in a factory. So it is very important to think about to really change and challenge this and criticize architectural practice and think about alternative interdependency labor, how architecture can function in reverse, not exploiting continuously architecture and design labor, but the opposite. I'm thinking, you know, like brainstorming about that. And indigenous worlding is important. I was speaking a lot about indigenous pedagogies. I mean, we architects who are giving architecture education pedagogy, we are not so much far from that. You know, we learn a lot from indigenous people, how they using, how they're building their oven, how they are building their neighborhoods, how they are building their housing. Most of them are architects. They are architects. They are architect. They're doing architecture without architects, and this is very inspiring. And how we can engage more and more with indigenous communities as an architect, not as a humanitarian contribution, but that I was showing in Ezidi refugee camp, how we can learn and archive by using design methodologies their knowledge, their and taking it as a heritage, you know, as a term, as a heritage. I was thinking, Marcela, about, I mean, those how to connect with architecture, pedagogy, and understanding also. And
Yeah, and I think that is the question of pedagogy. I think it's something that I also you kind of mentioned at some point, but I think it's crucial to your practice and your work. That is that there is in this process of practicing the common of social relations, it is inherently a practice of learning. That is, it's about engaging with the elements that maybe formalize the commons, from food to seeds to housing or to shelter, and in that process help kind of instituting, as you mentioned, in the commoning, constructing the infrastructure for that commoning to continue. Um, it is hard for me to think about that process of pedagogy within architecture schools, and I always look at your work and your kind of practices in school, and I've been trying to to incorporate a few things in my own classes, particularly in the context that I am located, in which, for example, just taking a walk or significant walk in our context, it's significantly radical as an act because there's no this space of the cities is not necessarily conceived for something as well. And I do that as a way of kind of just bringing back the space of the body, right? As a kind of we acknowledge that we could, and I say walk, but also just displacing us in from one place to another. So I I, I, I think that is that question of pedagogy of the struggle. I would like to think about it as well as something that doesn't necessarily exist as a kind of a margin, because sometimes we may understand. You mentioned the struggle as a kind of key component of commons, but I would like to think about it as well as something that we can do in more formalized institutions like the ones that I participate and some others, right? And you as well participate as educator. Um, so yeah, I think that these are for me the critical questions, the kind of the intersection of class and the question of labor. I think those are crucial as well. And one kind of maybe comment that I would like you to maybe elaborate is the gender, the notion of the gender space. There is a very strong understanding of of I'm not sure if it's a gender space or how to approach it, how to define it, because it is critical to how you present some of these spaces, right? That these are women and children-led, or particularly women-led spaces. So, it's what can we, how can we engage with that as a kind of idea of do we promote more gender spaces or non-gender, or how do we work around the kind of inclusiveness?
Marcelo, I don't, I'm not so much, I don't go there to experience and understand gender places. I'm not looking for spaces of feminism or something, you know. I have more, I think, female labor, or different kind of, mm, like vulnerable, especially community labor. It's for me sometimes very important to understand well how this laboring existing and contributing and producing in the space that affects and shape the space. And I think it is more like a methodology. um, if I go enter to a village in River Delta Sea, which I don't know the language, but I managed to find the village, which is not accessible by car, for example, highway. And how would you understand the space? I mean, it looks like a normal fishing village. Maybe is not so much different than the village in Turkey, in my homeland, in the seashore. But it is important to really spend time with the woman there, because then you see that how the space is functioning, how this village is functioning. And I don't want to be like a tailorist economic but phrasing that, but it is so important for me that when those women are waking up, they wake up 4 a.m. in the morning, 2 a.m. they go to fishing, they come back around 4 or 5 a.m. They sell the fisher to fishmongers. 11 o'clock they are done, and then maybe the husband goes to sleep, I don't know, she does a lot of other work. So there's always that, I would say, in many cases the woman does the most work always. And it was the same in Ezidi camp too. I mean, they are building the corridors, they are farming, they are looking after children. And so I don't want to make it so marginalized, but this is the reality. And then if you understand, if you work with them, helping them, for example, as a researcher, you don't need to interview them, you don't need to do any, I mean, you just can work with them and help them, and you understand that how this labor has been reproduced, and how they are helping each other, how the solidarity and shared interdependency is being produced. And this is very important, at least for me, to understand, and then how understand the space also, how this street is functioning, how this corridor is functioning, how this neighborhood is functioning. I see it mostly like that. There's a question.
I think Karin can
Yes, hi.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Pelin, how are you? following your train of thought, do you think that commenting is more less as a practice and more as a state of conscious, like this idea of mind and mindfulness? Like, how do you, within your experience, how do you define this mode of practicing? Is it come first and then you have the idea of it, or first you have to be open, kind of have this consciousness to allow yourself to then practice the commenting? I know
Yeah.
you address the spatial issues and the complexities around who
Yes. Yeah.
participates in this network, but I think
Yeah.
there's something about being, I don't know, in a state of mind of
Yeah.
either ambitioning it or
Have
accepting
yeah.
it. Can you talk about
Have
that?
yes, I understand what you mean. It's something like, the grammar. Yeah, this is what you're asking, and this is something like little bit goes to open more in the very beginning, when we discussed, David Harvey was saying so in the Rebel City book, he says that it's is commoning is a social building, social network, social relation. Other theorists are speaking about that, but this is not enough. Social relation, what kind of social relation? I mean, this is sometimes very inadequate um, definition. Of course, it has to do with those grammar that you're talking about, ethically minded, ethically open, and this, because this is about consistency. Um, I want to give one example. I'm a member of a refugee association here in Turkey. Is in Izmir in Çeşme, that is helping refugees who are crossing the Aegean Sea to Greek islands. And this association, they are living in a village they built themselves, and they want to move to another land, small land, to rebuild. And they contacted me to build an architecture team for that. They said, Pelin, can you can you build a team of designer? We are moving to another small land, which is very near, but we want again a village, a similar village that we are living. They built a village with everything ecologically, ethically consistent. I mean, they do compost, they do ecology. They are living with refugees. They are teaching, doing a lot of teaching to little children. I mean, they do all those, you can imagine, NGO work for refugees, and then a lot of health care they're organizing for them. They are working with female refugees, teaching solar panel wooden that will help you to charge your phone when you're lost in the sea or in the Balkan in the forest when you're crossing borders, irregular. And so they're doing many things, and then they said, uh, we want architects together to lead a team, and everything has to be consistent. This whole care infrastructure has to be like very well designed. And because commoning for them is not only about helping to refugees, is also about staying collectively, surviving collectively, you know and this is something was we are working on that with the designer. They want us to create those space that, housing, dormitory, food place, this that has to represent this whole care infrastructure. And this is really difficult work. It has a lot with social engaged design, involving with the refugees, NGO, volunteer workers together, brainstorming together, showing a draft of one of the design, and then continue with the other level of design. And each step we having discussion. They don't know anything about design and architecture, but they say they have saying, of course. So this is a normal, let's say, socially engaged design, social process design that we know for long years. And this is one thing. And then it's a lot about, really, as you say, being ethically open, that sharing this vulnerability, by not forgetting that although you have a citizenship paper, you are more maybe vulnerable than them, especially if you live in Turkey, maybe, or other countries. or US. I don't know. Everywhere is shit right now, so I don't know which one. But it's just that there is not so much an hierarchy anymore, in terms of survival, ethically survival, equally survival, and so on and so on. And this has to do is beyond social relation of commoning, I think, and more difficult.
I think that's a good way to transition into, and I said transition because this is an ongoing conversation that will just, I think, keep building up upon everyone. But I wanted to thank you, Pelin, so much. I took 100 notes, and we could just keep doing for 10 hours with you alone. So we will continue now with Elise, Elise Honchuk, who it's right there. So thanks again, Pelin and Marina, who gave us our two first presentations and conversations. We'll continue now with Elise Honchuk, who is a Berlin-based researcher, editor, educator, trained in landscape architecture, but also philosophy and geography. And her practices engages with transdisciplinary exploration of relationship between landscape, infrastructure, natural processes, human and more than human landscapes, and so on. And as I've been saying earlier, I will just do very brief bios for guests since we have them on our page. But I had paired Elise with which I'm also meeting for the first time. So thanks so much, Elise, for joining and accepting the invitation. That I paired Elise with the question of